only 12% of Americans are metabolically healthy.
Yeah, basically, that means that almost 9 out of 10 of us are walking around with these silent signs of metabolic dysfunction. And most of us don't really know it. We may have some general sense that maybe we're not as healthy as we should be, but we don't actually know what's going on inside of our bodies and that there's a cumulative effect over time. Welcome to MD Longevity Lab, where we're playing the long game. This is a podcast where science meets real life with expert insights, practical tips, and real-world tools to not only live longer, but live better. Our aim is to radically change the way medicine is practiced and enable individuals to age gracefully, maintaining health span and vitality well into their later years. We're your hosts, Dr. Nisha and Dr. Vikas Patel, physicians, partners in life, and parents balancing work, wellness, and everything in between. Let's dive in. So how's your day going? How's your weekend?
It's going great, minus the fact that I feel like an unpaid 0-star Uber driving the kids around.
We did have a lot of games this weekend.
How long did it take you to get there?
An hour and 10 minutes to get there for travel soccer.
Because there aren't enough teams to play within a 15-mile radius here. Got it. Yeah, travel sports has really become a racket.
What about when we had to travel to Arizona for a tournament?
Only to play the same teams that we would play here.
In all fairness, we did not play the same teams that we played here. We did lose every game, which we could easily have done here as well.
Yeah, it's kind of ridiculous because it's like they want these kids to be super specialized in their one sport, as opposed to like when we were growing up, we played basketball, softball, soccer, and we knew we weren't going pro.
Nobody really seems to value like the all-rounded kid who wants to play multiple sports, and because now everything is so specialized.
We're going to be dropping travel sports, and I'm super excited.
It will be nice not to travel.
Yeah, and have family dinners back and not be in the car from 4 to 9 p.m. every night.
10-year-old having practice until 9:30 p.m.
Yeah, crazy. Yeah.
All right. So getting back into the subject of this podcast, we can do a podcast about travel sports.
We should do a podcast about travel sports. And then we're going to get a lot of calls from angry parents like, no, but my Joey is going pro.
Yes.
You have not seen my kid play. Like, no, Linda, Joey's not going pro. Listen, Linda. Oh, I'm sorry to all the Lindas.
And if your Joey is actually going pro.
Yes. And if Linda's...
We will be his biggest fan.
Yes. If Linda's Joey is going pro, like I'll do a formal apology.
We need courtside tickets.
Yes, we do.
All right. Back to the business at hand. The plan for today is to give you guys an overview of metabolism and metabolic health. It's really the foundation of our health. There's a lot of topics to cover within metabolic health, and we will be taking a deeper dive into the specific topics later on and throughout the subsequent podcast. But this should give you guys a good overview on why this is important, some pitfalls about metabolism, and then just some basics on what things that we should be doing to manage our metabolic health.
Yeah. So today we're going to cover what metabolic health actually is. We're going to cover why it should matter to every single one of you. And we're also going to cover a lot of the biomarkers that we do, not only on ourselves, but all of our patients at MD Longevity Lab. Let's talk a little bit about why metabolic health matters. So metabolic health really is the foundation for pretty much every single one of our body's pathways. It is a direct impact on not only your metabolism, but energy production, hormone regulation, inflammatory pathways, and virtually every disease process. So that includes autoimmune disease, cardiovascular disease, dementia, cancer. So it really impacts every single one of us. So let's go through some of the metabolic health numbers. We've talked about in previous podcasts too, only 12% of Americans are metabolically healthy.
Yeah, basically that means that almost 9 out of 10 of us are walking around with these silent signs of metabolic dysfunction. And most of us don't really know it. We may have some general sense that maybe we're not as healthy as we should be, but we don't actually know what's going on inside of our bodies, and that there's a cumulative effect over time. I think it's best to think of it in the way that physicians do. We were introduced to this concept of metabolic syndrome. And so if we break down what metabolic syndrome is, then I think it gives you guys a better idea of what we're talking about when we're talking about metabolic health. Metabolic syndrome is a combination of a few very common medical problems that people can have. And that includes hypertension, it includes high cholesterol, and impaired glucose tolerance or diabetes. So when you have the combination of those three things, then we say that you have metabolic syndrome. Having any one of those things is already a risk factor for developing things like cardiovascular disease, heart attack, strokes, dementia. But when you combine all three of these things, that process is vastly accelerated. And so in general, when we're talking about metabolic health, we're talking about all three of those disease states.
So in the 70s, only 2% of Americans had diabetes. Fast forward to now, about 12% of Americans have diabetes, but 38% have prediabetes. So 50% of our population has impaired glucose tolerance.
So that's a whopping number of people that already have significant metabolic dysfunction.
And we hear from patients all the time, well, I have a family history of diabetes. I think there's a family history of lifestyle dysfunction, right? So that's poor nutrition, sedentary lifestyle, because metabolic dysfunction, we talked about metabolic syndrome, prediabetes, and diabetes. We're seeing staggering numbers right now compared to 50 years ago, right?
Absolutely. Why are we seeing more of it now? There's 100%, there's a genetic predisposition for it. That doesn't mean you're going to get it. And also, even if you are destined to get diabetes, when you get it in your life makes a huge difference. If you're pre-diabetic as a late teenager, you're 100% going to have diabetes sometime within the next 10 years. And then the average lifespan is supposed to be 80 years and you already have full diabetes by the time you're 25 or 28. Things aren't looking good for you making that full 80-year lifespan. So as opposed to you develop prediabetes in your late 60s and full diabetes sometime in your 70s, well, now the impact from that is much less. So yeah, I think to some degree, people wonder, well, what's actually going on? Why are we developing diabetes? Why does diabetes even exist in the first place? Diabetes essentially is our body hanging on to more sugar than it really needs. And it's more sugar floating around in the bloodstream, not being utilized either by our muscles or being stored away as fat like it's supposed to be when we have excess sugar floating around. The reason why humans even have this condition, period, and I'd like to clarify, we're talking about type 2 diabetes, not type 1 diabetes. Type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune disease where your body has attacked its own pancreas. That's a separate category that has nothing to do with our lifestyle issues or really even genetics. But type 2 diabetes is an acquired diabetes that we develop. It used to be just as an adult, but now we're seeing it happen earlier and earlier, even in the teenage years. And this happens more because of lifestyle choices. We have this genetic risk for diabetes, mostly because during times of famine, like in the last ice age, when our population dwindled down to a couple thousand people, the surviving people who were able to hang on to sugar when there was a scarcity of food were selected to survive. So we have these genes available in our gene pool that were really great for times of famine. But now that we live in this world of excess and in a world where really the food industry is incentivized to make food hyper palatable, right? It tastes really good and it's really calorically dense. Now those genes are not functioning in a good way for us. And we have this problem of excess. So that's one alarming trend, right, with diabetes. The other thing that contributes to that is obesity, right? So the main driving factor in our population, as you mentioned, Nisha, sedentary lifestyle, and obesity. So if we're eating too much for what we need, then we're constantly in oversupply of calories, constantly in an oversupply of sugar. And eventually our body just can't keep up with the amount of sugar we're consuming. And our pancreas can't keep making monster amounts of insulin, which is the hormone that allows us to absorb the sugar.
So I like to think of insulin as firefighters and glucose as like that little kindling of a fire. That's what insulin resistance is. And that eventually leads to diabetes. So you need more and more firefighters to put out this little fire. And I think that's an easy way for patients to conceptualize that your body eventually develops a tolerance and your pancreas eventually burns out.
Insulin is the cue for our muscles to take sugar out of the blood and store it in the muscle tissue as glycogen. It also is the cue for our fat cells to take up sugar and turn the excess sugar into fat. So a person who does not have diabetes, they make somewhere around 30 units of insulin naturally in their body. Someone who has diabetes can easily be making twice that, 3 times that, sometimes 4 times that amount of insulin to keep the blood sugars in a normal range. And that's where we run into problems because your pancreas gets tired eventually and it can't do that anymore.
So there's a lot of overlap between metabolic health and obesity. Obesity rates have significantly increased in the US since 1970. So in the early 70s, only about 15% of adults were considered obese, while in 2023, that figure has risen to 40.3%. And similarly, childhood obesity back in the 70s, it was around 5%, and it's more than tripled since then. So we're really seeing an epidemic kind of play out.
Yeah. And I think this follows very closely with the diabetes rates that we had just discussed. To piggyback off of that, the other diagnosis involved in metabolic syndrome is hypertension. And for those of you who don't know the numbers for hypertension, when your systolic blood pressure, which is the top number that gets reported, is 140 or higher, or the bottom number, the diastolic, is 90 or higher, then we say that now you have hypertension. So those statistics have also increased significantly over the last 50 years. And right now, according to CDC's latest data, basically from 2021 up until 2023, numbers of even hypertension have increased. And the current numbers are somewhere around 122 million adults have hypertension. So realistically, we're at a point where half the population has hypertension. Half the population has diabetes or prediabetes, and 75% of the population is overweight or obese. Like now you start to get why only 1 in 8, was that the number that you said?
Yeah.
1 in 8 people are actually metabolically healthy.
And I think we had talked about metabolic health affecting every single disease process, right? Since the 70s, infertility rates have risen. Men's testosterone levels have dropped significantly since the 70s. Male sperm counts have dropped. And that's a direct result of some of these numbers.
A common finding for women, right? PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome, right? Those numbers are very high and also tied very closely to obesity, prediabetes, and diabetes.
Yeah. So it really affects the young population, middle-aged, and obviously those of us that are hoping to live a long and healthy life, right? And maximize health span. So this really affects every single one of us, and we all should understand our risk.
To women's health, I mentioned PCOS. And just from the beginning of my career, we didn't see that nearly as much. And in that 20-year span, we see it so frequently now, and it mirrors the rates of metabolic dysfunction that exists in our population now.
Yeah, so I think metabolic dysfunction is the root cause for so many disease pathways, pretty much every single one that we can think of. And I think that's why all of us should really understand what our metabolic health looks like. And we're going to talk a little bit about all the different biomarkers, some blood testing, some in-office testing, other metrics that you can do to really get a bird's eye view of what your metabolic health looks like. Why don't we cover some of the core biomarkers and blood tests that a lot of patients can get at their primary care office, but then let's talk about some of the advanced biomarkers that we do on our patients, ourselves, and our longevity patients. I think everyone has heard of a fasting glucose. That is a blood test that you can get at your physician's office, and that's just what that glucose level is at that time. And then there's something called a hemoglobin A1C, and that's like a 3-month report card of what your glucose is. They might order a cholesterol panel, but looking at those 3 things, we get a lot of patients that say, well, my doctor told me I shouldn't worry because I don't have an impaired fasting glucose and my hemoglobin A1C is normal. So that means I'm metabolically healthy, right? So you can still be metabolically unhealthy and have normal screening tests. And so that's when we're taking a deeper dive into some of these advanced biomarkers that we have.
Yeah, both fasting glucose and A1C have their problems. And what I mean by that is there are people who are metabolically very healthy that on the particular day that they go in for their fasting blood work, their fasting blood glucose might be 100. And ideally, we would want it to be below 90. And the opposite can be true too, where somebody is metabolically unhealthy and their fasting glucose is 91. And so we're like, oh, they're actually doing pretty good. But then when we find out some of these other markers that we'll talk about, we see that their numbers actually aren't that great. Hemoglobin A1C is also very similar to that. It's an average glucose over this 90-day period, but it does not tell us how much insulin your body is actually utilizing to keep your sugar in that normal range. And so I think there are a few other advanced testing, biomarker tests that are useful, namely a fasting insulin level is very helpful. And then also a HOMA-IR, which is like a insulin resistance index. So if those numbers are elevated, then no matter what your fasting glucose or your hemoglobin A1C is, we know that your body is making way more insulin to keep your blood sugar in the normal range. So you don't technically have diabetes yet or prediabetes, because for prediabetes, we talk about your A1C being 5.7 to 6.4. And so your A1C might be 5.5, but your HOMA-IR and your fasting insulin levels may be sky high. And that means that your body is generating tons and tons of excess insulin in order to keep those sugars in that normal range. It will only be able to do that for so long.
So when we have patients that have a normal fasting glucose and a normal hemoglobin A1C, which is what the traditional model of medicine tests for, right? And then we order a HOMA-IR, a fasting insulin, and some of the other biomarkers that we're going to test for, and they're abnormal. So we're catching it before it even becomes prediabetes. And that's when patients have to do much less work to turn that ship around versus when a patient has full-fledged diabetes, it's just a lot more work, right? Their pancreas is already producing a ton of insulin. So if we can catch patients before they even become pre-diabetics and say, hey, look, in another couple years at this rate, you're going to be a pre-diabetic. And if we don't change then, 5 years later, you're going to become a full-fledged diabetic. I think that information is so empowering for patients if they can find out what's happening 10 years before it actually happens.
Exactly. Like the idea is that the definitions of diabetes and prediabetes, like this is semantics. Like we've just artificially made cutoffs of this. I like to think of it, and Nisha, you like to think of this more as impaired glucose tolerance, right? So if any of these markers are truly abnormal, then you have impaired glucose tolerance. If the only thing that you have right now is that you're making more insulin, now this is the opportunity to fix something, because if we fix it right now, there will be no long-term damage to your body. If you don't fix it right now, then you are on this path of long-term damage. And so you're absolutely right.
So let's talk a little bit about our next biomarker. So that's high sensitivity CRP, C-reactive protein. And that's a test that, it not only is an indicator of metabolic health, but cardiovascular health and a bunch of other disease pathways in the body.
Yeah, social media has very much popularized inflammation. And I think that term gets thrown around inappropriately in so many different avenues. It Unfortunately, this test is not specific for you have metabolic syndrome or you have cardiovascular disease. What it tells us is that if it is elevated, that you are at higher risk for some type of cardiovascular event. And the big drivers, so if you just happen to be sick, you happen to catch COVID or you're fighting a pneumonia, temporarily your high sensitivity CRP will be elevated because there is an inflammatory response to fight the infection. If you are feeling completely fine and there's no active infection going on and your high sensitivity CRP is 3, then we get worried that there's a lot of inflammation in your body that shouldn't be there. And we have to start searching for what's going on.
But this test is not something we normally test for in the traditional model, but it's a test that we run on all of our patients pretty much throughout the year.
Yeah, it's a test that has to be trended over time. Like one abnormal reading could be a whole host of things. You haven't been sleeping well. You're fighting a subclinical infection. But if you have a couple of them in a row that are all saying that things are elevated, you have this high inflammatory state, it's most likely coming from some form of the diseases that cause metabolic syndrome. So impaired glucose tolerance, hypertension, and cholesterol. These tend to go together with what our diet is and what our exercise levels are. And most of the time when people clean up their diet and their fitness routine, those high sensitivity CRP markers start to go back down to normal. The cutoff for normal is 1. And generally, I want to see people really at below 0.6 or 0.8. We start to get worried when it's over 1. And we're really, really worried once it's hitting somewhere around 3, because that really indicates a higher level of inflammation. And there's actually, like, in the next year, we know that there's an increased risk of a cardiovascular event when your numbers are running that high and they're persisting to be that high.
So we're going to jump to something that's not a blood test, and it's a test that we run on ourselves and all of our patients, and that's measuring our exact visceral fat levels. So why don't you tell us a little bit about how visceral fat has an impact on metabolic health?
So visceral fat is the fat that surrounds our organs inside of our belly. And this is different than the fat that is hiding under our skin. That's called subcutaneous fat. And in general, that's the safer place for our body to put those excess calories that we might be eating.
We may not like how we look in a bathing suit with excess subcutaneous fat, but it's not harmful to our health.
It's not harmful, not in this way, not in the sense of metabolic syndrome, correct. So visceral fat tends to increase the risk of metabolic syndrome, which are those 3 conditions: hypertension, high cholesterol, and diabetes. And so most of the time that somebody has this elevated CRP, this is the driver. They have an elevated amount of visceral fat. We like to measure that using a DEXA scan. And so we will talk later about DEXA and the specifics of DEXA.
So it's a whole body DEXA scan, which is different than a DEXA scan that a physician may order on a woman who's 65.
Correct. So you usually can't get this at the hospital where you get your care at, because they're typically just doing a bone density DEXA scan. Whole body DEXA scan, the same machine is actually able to run a different algorithm and scan your whole body to give us information about how much muscle we have, how much total fat we have, and much more specifically, how much visceral fat we have. And so that's the gold standard that we use for figuring out what someone's risk is for developing metabolic syndrome. If they have a high visceral fat amount, then we know that even without seeing lab work, we know that there's a decent chance that either the patient's going to have hypertension, high cholesterol, or impaired glucose tolerance.
That they're going to have poor metabolic health.
Correct.
So it's interesting because just half a pound increase of visceral fat in the wrong place can be so harmful.
Correct. It's not the same as our total body fat, which half pound, 5 pounds, 10 pounds, 20 pounds even doesn't change our health status. But visceral fat is very different. A very small amount of visceral fat can make a huge difference in our health. And that's really when some of those kind of popular terms like what's skinny fat, right? Skinny fat is really this problem. It's somebody who overall is not really overweight. They're probably pretty close to their ideal weight, but they're carrying whatever excess fat that they do have, they're carrying it inside of their gut. And so in clothes, they look normal, but they tend to be the ones that have diabetes, even though they don't look like the classic diabetes type patient. And there is a genetic correlation. These are the people where everybody in the family has developed diabetes, right? But it also correlates to they tend to also have very little lean muscle mass.
And I think it's important to note that in perimenopause and menopause, women tend to deposit more of their fat in their viscera. And not only that, a lot of their muscle, if it's not being used, gets converted to fat. So men have a more linear way of depositing fat in their viscera. For women, pretty much after the age of 40 or whenever you start to feel those perimenopausal symptoms, we're just starting to deposit fat in those dangerous places, which is why we see an increased risk of diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and problems as we head into menopause.
You're absolutely right. Like men and women have about a 10-year gap in onset of cardiovascular disease symptoms. And so we have all of these risk calculators that we use for figuring out who's at risk for developing heart attacks and things like that. And age is a risk factor for heart disease. For men, age becomes a risk factor at the age of 45. For women, it becomes a risk factor at 55. And the main reason for women having that later age risk factor is that estrogen is protective for most women. And when they lose the estrogen after menopause, then their risks starts to elevate just as much as men's does. So you're absolutely right. One of the other bad things about women losing that estrogen is that they tend to also lose the testosterone. They're losing both estrogen and testosterone. And that's why they have a less lean muscle mass as they go into that postmenopausal phase.
Yeah. So I'm in that phase where I'm like, I'm doing the exact same thing in my 40s that I did in my 30s, but it's not working. So we have a little bit of an uphill battle, I would say, for those of us that are in these perimenopause years. But I think once we're aware of it, it's so much easier to target our workouts, our nutrition, and dial that in.
There's a lot of wonderful things about youth, and the net gains that we get from exercise and diet modification stuff when we're younger, things tend to just be a little bit easier. It does not mean at any point that as we get older, we can't net benefit from making those lifestyle modifications. We just have to do it in a different way. And the gains don't necessarily happen as quickly at times when we're older as they did when we were younger.
So let's go through some of the other biomarkers that we test for.
Yeah. So another one that's, I think, important is uric acid. It's also when it is elevated, it is also a marker for metabolic dysfunction. So most people, when they are eating a high carb, high fat diet, they tend to have elevated amounts of uric acid. So it correlates very nicely with the development of impaired glucose tolerance. Another one that we want to pay very close attention to are our liver function tests. So our AST and ALT. ALT is probably the more important one when we're talking about metabolic health because it tends to go up when we develop fatty liver disease. Fatty liver disease has gone through many different name changes over the last couple decades. And so when these numbers start to elevate and there's not another reason for a liver insult, it tends to be our diet that's causing the problem. And our liver is having to store excess fat as part of our body's compensatory mechanism for just storing excess calories. And so once you start running out of places to store it, you start storing it everywhere, including your muscle tissue, your subcutaneous tissue under your skin, your viscera, your visceral fat stores, but then also in the viscera themselves, which are your liver is one of your organs. And so this is a bad sign that now you're also going to be developing impaired glucose tolerance.
And for a lot of our patients, we do full body MRI. So both you and I have had the Prenuvo full body MRI for cancer screening, but that test can also show fatty liver. So we've had patients, we know on all their blood tests that they have metabolic syndrome, but when they can see on their MRI oh my gosh, my liver is just storing fat. I just have fatty liver from excess, from overeating. And I think then it's a wake up call for them.
Essentially, you can reverse this process, right? If we're going into some type of calorie restriction and we're losing body fat, then you lose body fat everywhere in your body, including your liver, and you can reverse these numbers. And so we do have that. We do have patients who come back for repeat testing after some diet and lifestyle modification, and all these numbers start to improve.
So let's talk a little bit about ApoB and Lp(a).
Sure. ApoB is probably the best marker for how we're metabolizing our lipids. There is a genetic component to this. There is a diet component to this, but for most people, the genetic component probably outweighs the diet component. ApoB, you're used to probably hearing what your total cholesterol is and what your quote unquote bad cholesterol is, and that's the LDL cholesterol. Traditionally, you would get your LDL checked, and that's what your doctor would base treatment guidelines on. ApoB is probably a better marker because it encompasses all of the quote unquote bad cholesterols. So all of the transporters that have difficulty transiting the membrane or the wall of the blood vessel and that get stuck, ApoB is a measure of all of those. When your ApoB is elevated, you have a higher risk of developing cardiovascular disease and strokes. And so that's part of one of the big tests that we should be checking. Yes, the guidelines of having your total cholesterol below 200 and your LDL cholesterol in general below 100, to some degree, there is some validity to that, but it doesn't make as much sense in light of the fact that we can order an ApoB and know exactly how much of the not great transporters that you have floating around and then target treatment based on that. LPA is actually another lipoprotein, but LPA, that one is purely a genetic risk. There's a gene that codes for it.
And Lp(a) is a one-time lifetime test. So this is not something that you're ordering every year.
Whenever you hear that there's somebody young that you're acquainted with that had a heart attack very early in life, they're in their 30s or 40s, and they have a heart attack and they're otherwise healthy, usually it boils down to they're positive for LPA. It depends on the population that you look at, but somewhere between 10% to 12% of the population is positive for this gene. And so if you have a family history of valve issues or early cardiac issues, most likely this gene runs in the family to some degree. It's worth getting it tested.
And a lot of times these are patients who have never smoked, right? They're marathon runners. So we've all heard those stories. He runs, he cycles, he does triathlons, but he had a heart attack at age 35. And those are generally the patients who have high Lp(a). So there's a genetic predisposition to these patients having this underlying cardiovascular disease. But these are patients that if we had that test, that one-time Lp(a) screening test done when they were in their mid-20s or early 30s, we could potentially prevent that heart attack from happening.
Yeah. We put those patients on maximum lipid lowering strategies. There are a few drugs in the pipeline that I think are going to come to fruition pretty quickly, like within the next 5 years that target LPA. But until then, we have excellent lipid lowering drugs. And people who have LPA, we basically lower their cholesterol levels down to the pediatric levels of cholesterol, like what babies are born with, which is somewhere around the 5th percentile for the population. And those patients actually end up doing really well.
And I think another useful tool that we did on ourselves, and it was pretty eye-opening, is a CGM, which is a continuous glucose monitor. We encourage our patients to try this, even if they're not diabetics, for 3 months, because you can see how some of your behaviors, the foods you eat, the timing of when you eat, your activity level, what your glucose is. So we've gone out to eat and stuffed our faces with steaks, cocktails, dessert. And then the entire night, our glucose was all over the place. And lo and behold, we had a shitty night of sleep. Surprise, surprise. We ate poorly and we saw the consequences. And, CGM is not meant to punish people. I think if we're going into it with a growth mindset that I'm going to learn from this. I love to eat. And I learned that...
What did you learn?
You know what I learned? I learned that if I eat a big fatty meal. It could be a lasagna, a steak, French fries, whatever. As long as I go for a 20-minute walk right after dinner, my glucose is actually pretty steady. So that's my little biohack that I learned. So
CGM is very useful. So other than figuring out the little hacks that inside of our particular bodies, because everybody responds to different foods in different ways. There's some things that might not give me much of a glucose spike, but might give her more of a glucose spike. And so we can figure that out by more or less experimenting when we have a CGM. Another useful thing that we can track with continuous glucose monitoring is using it as a proxy for an oral glucose challenge test. So I think women who are pregnant have to do glucose tolerance tests. And I know you mentioned that very thick syrup doesn't taste very good. It's very sugary, right?
we have to do that. Yeah, we had to do that in pregnancy. And you can't drink coffee, right? You've got to drink this.
You're not allowed to drink anything other than that, right?
I know. I did sneak some sips of coffee, though.
Of course you did.
And I failed my glucose tolerance test.
Yeah, I do remember that once. So CGM is another way to get the same information. Like what an oral glucose tolerance test is doing is you get this huge load of sugar, and then they're watching with blood draws what your blood glucose is doing at an hour after that sugar load, another hour after that sugar load. So we can essentially do the same thing by what we're eating in our diet. If I just eat a whole bowl of ice cream and then I am monitoring what my glucose does on the CGM, we know that really in 1 hour's time, our blood glucose should be back to normal. And if it's not back to normal, then we have impaired glucose tolerance. And so that's another tool that would help us in figuring out whether we're at risk for metabolic syndrome. There's a couple other diagnostics, I think. We talked about DEXA, but why don't you talk a little bit about waist circumference?
So waist circumference is also a good proxy for metabolic syndrome. And we're measuring your waist circumference to your height and taking that ratio. So that ratio should be less than 0.5.
Yeah, the old metric that we used to follow is the BMI. And the problem with BMI is that it's meant more for population level. It doesn't mean something specific for a given individual.
And it doesn't really tell us anything about how metabolically healthy you are.
What your body composition is.
Right.
Yeah. So that's why the waist circumference to height ratio is helpful. When it's over 0.5, then literally, and that's measuring in inches how tall you are, how wide you are. And if that ratio is over 0.5, then we know that you're at a higher risk for having one of those things that we include in metabolic syndrome.
So let's just quickly summarize these biomarkers that we do to assess our metabolic health. So the ones that you can get that are readily available at your doctor's office would be a fasting glucose, a hemoglobin A1C, and your lipid panel, your cholesterol panel. Some of the more advanced biomarkers that we are doing on our patients, and we recommend all of our listeners who want to take a proactive approach to their health. So we recommend getting a fasting insulin, a HOMO-IR, a high sensitivity C-reactive protein, an ApoB level, an LP(a), liver function test, uric acid, and then a full body DEXA scan, which is giving your precise visceral fat levels. So we talked a lot about why metabolic health is so important, but let's go into what are some things that we can do to improve our metabolic health. And a lot of these things are getting back to the basics. So let's go through our top 5 things.
So I think sleep is underrated. Sleep is probably super high on the list that we should be getting 7 to 9 hours of sleep. When you wear a continuous glucose monitor and say you only sleep 3 or 4 hours in a night for various reasons, your blood sugar ends up higher the following day. Your body is not as sensitive to the insulin that it's making when you are not well rested. There's all sorts of other issues, right, about being drowsy and not functioning as well. But metabolically, we don't function as well when we're not getting enough sleep. So that's probably number one.
Yeah. And we always talk about muscle, right? Muscle health. We call that the currency of aging. So the more muscle you have, the better you're able to metabolize glucose. So especially as we age, it's really important not only to preserve that muscle that we otherwise would be losing, but to put on muscle. So I tell my peers that are in their 40s, put as much muscle as you can on now before we hit 50 or close to that age where we're hitting menopause, because it just gets a lot harder. It's not impossible, but it's just much easier to make those gains now. So strength training, putting on some muscle, that's number two.
Yeah, our excess sugar that we eat in our diet, the first place our body looks to put it is in our muscle tissue, because muscle primarily uses sugar to do its work. Focusing on, along those same lines, focusing on protein and fiber intake, both are equally important for our metabolism. If you are exercising, then your body is going through more protein to repair the damage to all of our muscles and tendons that occur from the exercise. So if we're eating more protein, we're able to repair more efficiently. Plus, protein just happens to be a little bit of an appetite suppressant because it takes longer for us to process. It costs us more. 1 gram of protein that we eat costs us a little bit more to process than 1 gram of fat or 1 gram of carbs. So there's this dual benefit. Fiber is important because fiber helps us to keep our bowel habits regular. It also helps to reduce the amount of cholesterol that we absorb from our diet. And so people who generally eat a pretty high fiber diet tend to also have lower levels of cholesterol.
And I think another big one is reducing ultra processed foods. For Americans, on average, 75% of their diet comes from ultra processed foods. And for kids, about 80% of their diets come from ultra processed foods. So this trend is not getting better, which is why we want to raise some awareness and hopefully reverse these numbers. Ultra processed foods, they're calorie dense, right? We've talked about these food manufacturers making it ultra palatable. They taste really well. They're easy to chew, and they don't give the normal signals of, let's say we're eating an apple. That gives us the signal that we should be full. These ultra processed blunt those signals. So we can eat 1,200 calories worth of potato chips and still go back for more. Whereas it's nearly impossible to eat 1,200 calories of apples, right? You'd be so full, you wouldn't have any more room for it. So I think eliminating those ultra processed foods and getting back to whole foods, right? Meat, eggs, vegetables, fruits. And even in our household, we don't limit our kids from fruits, veggies, meats, eggs. It's more the pantry snacks, cereals, all those things we try and limit them from.
Yeah, I think we'll definitely be talking later about processed foods and I think a little bit about what the food industry is doing wrong in managing our diets and the kind of catch-22 that we've fallen into with modern food. Another one I think is alcohol intake and just general stress levels from life. Alcohol is almost as bad nutritiously. Well, it's probably the worst food that we can have nutritiously for us because it serves no nutrition goal. Even fats serve a role in our body. We have to have some degree of fat in our body in order for our body to function correctly, just like we have to have carbs and we have to have protein. We don't have to have alcohol. So alcohol is pretty calorie dense, almost as calorie dense as fats are, and it doesn't give us any nutritional benefit. And so there's a lot of empty calories involved in drinking alcohol, especially if you're mixing it with something sugary to make it taste better. Stress, I always tell my patients, it's easy for me to tell you to de-stress your life. It's obviously very difficult to do that. But stress operates in our system very much like lack of sleep operates in our system, where when we are in very high stressful situations, we tend to be more insulin resistant. Our blood glucose levels tend to be a little bit higher. And so we have to figure out better ways to manage that stress, whether it's through talking with our loved ones, mindfulness exercises, physical exercise. These are all excellent ways to allow our body some of the natural cues to reduce those stress hormones in our system. What about cardio exercise, just in general for metabolic syndrome?
We usually ask our patients to track their steps because on average, we tend to overestimate how active we are, right? We hear patients say, well, I walked to the train station. we tell them, okay, why don't you track your steps for a week and see where we're at? And they'll come back with, wow, 4,000. By CDC standards, that's sedentary. For our goal for ourselves is really to shoot for 10,000 steps a day. I would say at a minimum for our patients, we recommend 8,000, whether that's going for a walk after every meal. For some of our patients that have sedentary jobs, right? They're sitting at a desk. Get up and move, right? Do some squats, walk around the house if you're working from home. These little interventions are really going to make a big impact on your metabolic health.
Absolutely. So I think that pretty much sums up the things that we wanted to cover. We are going to take a deeper dive later on into a lot of these topics to give you more specifics about what hypertension is, what high cholesterol is, all the things that, even talking about medication interventions. But this was supposed to be meant to be just a general overview, because we're going to be using these terms like metabolic syndrome and metabolic health in future episodes.
Yeah. And we don't want to discourage any of our patients. Truth be told, I was metabolically unhealthy. So I fell into that majority. 88% of us are metabolically unhealthy in this country. So that's where I started, right? And I'm now in that 12% of metabolically healthy people. Once you know the information, it's almost impossible not to do anything with that. And for me, it was an eye-opener, right? I want to live a full life, but I want to be healthy for all those years. And learning that every disease process is fueled by poor metabolic health really forced me to take action. The vast majority of our patients, sometimes finding out these test results, they're like, oh gosh, what do I do with them? They're better with these few interventions. And a lot of them have turned this ship around in 6 months, some in a year, but these numbers are not set in stone. We can't really do anything until we know where we stand.
Yeah, you're right. I think the main goal here is that we remember those kind of big chronic disease buckets, because that's where this really falls into, right? Like those big chronic disease buckets are neurodegenerative conditions like dementia, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and cancers. And all of those things are tied into our metabolic health. All of those conditions are made worse by having poor metabolic health. And so this is what I consider primary prevention. If we figure out a way to intervene at the earliest stages and prevent the onset of these diseases, then we are preventing the onset of those big four chronic diseases that account for the majority of mortality in our culture.
But in the meantime, make sure you get your numbers checked, get your blood work, and know that you have the power to change your health for the better.
Yeah, we're definitely going to get into some of those lifestyle hacks as we go through this podcast. Please let us know if you guys have any questions, and feel free to direct message us, and we'd be happy to learn about your journey. We're here for it. Otherwise, keep playing the long game. Thank you for playing the long game with MD Longevity Lab. You can visit us at www.mdlongevitylab.com to learn more about how we can support you on your journey. Stay connected with us on social media at MD Longevity Lab for tips, updates, and behind-the-scenes insights. If you enjoyed today's episode, we'd love it if you subscribed, left us a rating, or shared it with someone you know who's also playing the long game. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.